In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Australia was a backpacker's paradise. The country's youth visa program drew tens of thousands of young Europeans every year. They worked in fruit-picking towns, slept in hostels in King's Cross, and traveled long distances by hitchhiking. The Hume Highway, the main artery between Sydney and Melbourne, was a known route. Sticking your thumb out felt safe. It felt ordinary. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was 44 years old in 1989. He was one of 14 children from a working-class family in the southwestern suburbs of Sydney. He worked for the New South Wales Department of Main Roads, a job that involved long hours on remote stretches of highway and intimate knowledge of forest tracks, fire trails, and pine plantations. He carried weapons in his vehicle. He was charming when he wanted to be. He had a long history of minor offenses, but nothing that flagged him to investigators looking for someone capable of much worse. He knew the Belanglo State Forest well. The forest sits roughly 130 kilometers southwest of Sydney, a vast pine plantation crossed by rough fire trails that few civilians ever traveled. Locals used parts of it for target shooting. To anyone unfamiliar with the area, it was a maze. To Ivan Milat, it was as familiar as a backyard. The first to disappear were two 19-year-olds from Victoria, James Gibson and Deborah Everest. They left a music festival near Sydney in December 1989 and were never seen again. Their families reported them missing. Police filed reports. Time passed. They became, in the language of the era, two more young people who had probably moved on, gotten lost, drifted away. They had not drifted. They were already in the forest. Over the next 2 years, the pattern repeated. In January 1991, a young German woman named Simone Schmidl vanished while traveling to meet her mother in Melbourne. In December of that same year, a young German couple, Anja Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer, disappeared from King's Cross. In April 1992, two British friends, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, set out from Sydney intending to hitchhike south. None of them arrived at their destinations. None of them called home. They simply stopped existing in the visible world. The discovery began by accident. In September 1992, two runners training in Belanglo State Forest noticed a strange smell drifting through the pines. They followed it and found human remains partially covered by branches and forest debris. Police were called. The body was identified as Joanne Walters. A short distance away, hidden under similar coverings, lay Caroline Clark. The crime scene revealed details that would define the entire investigation. The bodies had been carefully concealed. Spent cartridge cases were scattered nearby. The killer had not panicked. He had taken time. He had treated the forest like a workshop he intended to return to. Police searched the surrounding area for weeks but found nothing more. The investigation slowed. Then almost exactly 1 year later, in October 1993, more remains were found, Deborah Everest and James Gibson, the two who had vanished 4 years earlier. Within days, a wider search of the forest uncovered the German victims. 7 bodies in 5 separate burial sites, all within a few kilometers of each other. The Australian public was stunned. The killer was given a name in the press, the backpacker murderer. A special task force was formed. It was called Task Force Air. Task Force Air faced a forensic puzzle of extraordinary complexity. The crime scenes had been exposed to weather for months, in some cases years. But the forest had also preserved things, bullet casings, fragments of fabric, items the killer had left behind. Investigators recovered cigarette butts, cordage used to bind victims, and a distinctive type of cartridge case that pointed to a particular rifle. A Ruger 10-22, a semi-automatic .22 caliber weapon, with modifications consistent with a specific aftermarket magazine. Ballistics experts could now say something concrete. The same firearm had been used at multiple sites. The killer was a single person, or a tightly connected group, returning to the same forest with the same weapon. Tire impressions and vehicle tracks recovered near the dump sites pointed to a 4-wheel drive vehicle. The forensic team documented every track, every fiber, every scrap of evidence. None of it on its own named a suspect, but together it built a profile, a man with bush skills, vehicle access, firearms knowledge, and an intimate familiarity with Belanglo. The break came not from the forest, but from across the ocean. In late 1993, as news of the Australian discoveries spread internationally, a British man named Paul Onions watched the reports from his home in Birmingham. 4 years earlier, in January 1990, he had been hitchhiking south from Sydney when a man in a 4-wheel drive picked him up near Casula. The driver had been friendly at first, then increasingly tense. He had pulled over, produced a revolver, and tried to restrain Paul with a rope. Paul had fought free, leapt from the vehicle, and run into the highway, where a passing motorist had stopped and saved his life. Paul had reported the incident to local Australian police at the time. The report had been filed, and in the volume of paperwork moving through the system, effectively forgotten. Now watching news of 7 dead backpackers found in a forest along the same highway where he had been attacked, Paul Onions picked up the phone and called Australia. His call reactivated a 4-year-old paper trail. Detectives flew him back to Sydney. He described the attacker. He described the vehicle. He remembered the man calling himself Bill. Investigators began cross-referencing every lead, every suspect, every employee of the Department of Main Roads, every registered owner of a 4-wheel drive matching the description, every licensed owner of a Ruger 1022. The lists overlapped at one name, Ivan Milat. On May 22, 1994, heavily armed police raided Milat's home in Eagle Vale. Inside, they found a Ruger 1022 rifle, hidden in a wall cavity that ballistics would match to cartridges recovered from Belanglo. They found camping equipment, backpacks, sleeping bags, and clothing belonging to the victims. They found rope consistent with material recovered from crime scenes. In total, investigators cataloged hundreds of items connecting Milat to the murders. Paul Onions, shown a photo board, picked him out without hesitation. Ivan Milat's trial began in March 1996. He pleaded not guilty and maintained his innocence to the end, attempting to blame other members of his own family. The jury was unconvinced. After deliberation, he was convicted of all 7 murders and the attempted murder of Paul Onions. He received 7 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Forensic psychiatrists and criminologists who later studied the case identified patterns common to organized serial offenders. Milat planned methodically. He chose victims who were vulnerable but anonymous travelers far from home, whose disappearances would take days or weeks to register. He used a hunting ground he knew better than the investigators ever could. He kept trophies, an unusual and revealing behavior. The personal items found at his home were not loot in any economic sense. They were souvenirs. Behavioral analysts noted his presentation: clean, employed, sociable, capable of sustaining the trust of strangers long enough to get them into his vehicle. This is sometimes called the mask of normality. It is one of the most disturbing features of organized offenders because it works against the instinct most people rely on to keep themselves safe, the feeling that danger announces itself. What no expert was able to fully explain was the motive. Milat himself never offered one. He gave no statement, no confession, no insight. The psychological record of the Belanglo killings is in many ways a record of silence. What investigators reconstructed, they reconstructed without his help. The reasons remained locked inside him until his death from cancer in October 2019. There is a lesson buried in this case for anyone who studies criminal investigation. The breakthrough was not a single piece of evidence. It was the accumulated weight of patient work, a forgotten witness statement, a ballistics match, a tire impression, a phone call from across the world, a name appearing on 3 different lists at the same time. No single thread caught Ivan Milat. The net did. CTA 1213 Min, if you find yourself drawn to the cases that test the limits of investigation, the cold files, the ones that wait decades for a single phone call to crack them open, consider subscribing to CrimeDossier. Every week we look at the cases where the evidence was always there, waiting for the right person to see it. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Outro 1315 Min. 7 young people went into Belanglo State Forest who should have gone home. Their names: Deborah Everest, James Gibson, Simone Schmidl, Gabor Neugebauer, Anya Habschied, Caroline Clark, Joanne Walters, are remembered today not because of how they died, but because of who they were before they met Ivan Milat. Students. Travelers, children of families who waited years for answers. Paul Onions survived because he ran, because a stranger stopped on a highway, because 4 years later he saw a news bulletin and made a phone call. The investigation succeeded because it accepted that no single clue would be enough, and that patience is itself a form of evidence. There are still cases out there like Belanglo was in 1992, known horrors with no name attached. Somewhere, a witness is watching the news. Somewhere, a file is waiting to be reopened. And somewhere, a thread is waiting to be pulled. Until next time. Between 1989 and 1992, 7 young backpackers vanished along Australia's Hume Highway. Their bodies were eventually found hidden in the Belanglo State Forest, a remote pine plantation southwest of Sydney. This is the story of how Australian investigators, with patient forensic work and one extraordinary phone call from a British survivor, finally identified the killer behind one of the most chilling serial murder cases in modern history, Ivan Milat. In this crime dossier documentary, we trace the investigation from the first accidental discovery in September 1992 through the establishment of Task Force Air to the ballistics evidence, vehicle tracks, and survivor testimony that closed the net. We examine the criminal psychology of an organized offender who hid in plain sight as an ordinary road worker, and the lesson his capture offers about the cumulative power of careful detective work. Timestamps: 0000, the hitchhiker who got away 00, 15 a highway, a forest, a question 01, 00 the setup 03, 00 the crime 06, 00 the investigation 09, 00 the psychology 12, 00 why these cases matter 13, 00 final thoughts. Subscribe for weekly true crime case files, cold case breakdowns, and forensic investigation deep dives. True crime cold case criminal psychology, Ivan Milat forensic investigation.